In the quiet suburbs of Henderson, Nevada, a 62-year-old retired school principal was about to uncover a family betrayal so painful it would change her life forever. What began as a Mother's Day celebration transformed into a nightmare when Margaret Reynolds found herself standing before a locked door at her own son's house. The woman who had dedicated her life to nurturing not only her own children but generations of students was about to learn the harshest lesson of all about the limits of family loyalty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Reynolds wasn't your typical grandmother. Her silver-streaked dark hair was always impeccably styled, her clothes selected with the same careful attention to detail that had defined her 35-year career in education. Even in retirement, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had managed school districts and navigated the complex politics of parent-teacher relationships. But as she stood on the cobblestone pathway leading to her son Eric's front door, elegant in her lavender dress and clutching a homemade lemon meringue pie, all her experience dealing with difficult situations couldn't prepare her for what was about to happen. The May afternoon sunshine cast long shadows across the neatly manicured lawn of the suburban home. Through her designer sunglasses, Margaret could see the cars parked in the driveway, her daughter Olivia's blue sedan, her son-in-law Marcus's truck, and several others she recognized as belonging to extended family members. The Mother's Day gathering she'd been looking forward to for weeks was clearly underway. She checked her watch, 2 p.m., exactly the time specified in Eric's text message invitation. Margaret shifted the pie to one hand and reached for the doorbell with the other. The familiar chime echoed inside the house, followed by the sound of laughter that suddenly went quiet. She waited, counting the seconds in her head as she'd done during countless school assemblies. 30 seconds passed. A minute. She rang again, holding the button longer this time. Through the decorative glass panels flanking the door, she could see movement, shadows passing back and forth in what she knew was the foyer. "Hello," she called out, her voice carrying the pleasant but firm tone she'd perfected during decades of school announcements. "It's Mom. My hands are full with the pie." No response. Setting the pie down carefully on the porch table, Margaret peered through the side window. The sight that greeted her made her breath catch in her throat. The formal dining room table was set for a celebration, her Mother's Day celebration, but her place was conspicuously absent. Instead of the 10-place settings she expected, there were only 9, arranged around a table adorned with fresh flowers and elegant tableware. Eric's wife Vanessa moved through the dining room, placing a final water glass at each setting. She wore a floral dress Margaret had never seen before, her blonde hair styled in an elaborate updo that spoke of special occasions and careful preparation. When Vanessa glanced toward the window, Margaret waved, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Vanessa's expression didn't change. She simply turned away, disappearing into the kitchen without acknowledgement. Margaret's smile faltered as confusion gave way to the first flickers of hurt. She tried the doorknob, expecting it to turn as it always had during her weekly visits to help with her grandchildren's homework or to drop off home-cooked meals when Eric and Vanessa were too busy with their demanding careers. The knob wouldn't budge. She reached into her purse for the spare key Eric had given her years ago when they'd first bought the house, a key she'd used countless times when babysitting the children or watering plants during family vacations. The key slid into the lock but wouldn't turn. The familiar tumblers that should have yielded to her touch remained stubbornly immobile. The realization dawned slowly, like a cold shadow creeping across her consciousness. The locks had been changed. Margaret's phone buzzed in her purse. For a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding, a mix-up about the time or date. But the text wasn't from Eric or Vanessa. It was from her daughter Olivia, running late to Eric's. "Traffic terrible. Save me some of Mom's lemon pie if she's brought it." The message confirmed what Margaret already knew: this wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding. Her children were gathered inside for Mother's Day, and she, their mother, was deliberately being kept outside. She called Eric's number, listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Eric Reynolds. Leave a message and I'll get back to you when I can." The automated voice felt cold, impersonal. "Eric, it's Mom. I'm outside your house for the Mother's Day dinner, but it seems the door is locked, and my key doesn't work. Could you let me in? I brought the lemon pie you asked for." She tried to keep her voice light, but even to her own ears, it sounded strained. Vanessa's number went straight to voicemail. Margaret stood on the porch, her carefully applied lipstick suddenly feeling too bright, too optimistic for the situation unfolding around her. Through the window, she could see her son now, adjusting something on the buffet table. He was so close, just a few yards away, yet unreachable. "Excuse me, dear, is everything all right?" Margaret turned to find her neighbor Mrs. Chen approaching from the sidewalk. Lily Chen was 70 years old and had lived next door to Eric and Vanessa since they'd moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago. She walked with a slight limp now, a souvenir from a recent hip replacement, but her eyes were as sharp as ever beneath her wide-brimmed sun hat. "Oh, hello Mrs. Chen. Happy Mother's Day," Margaret forced a smile. "I seem to be having a little trouble with the door. I think something might be wrong with the lock." Mrs. Chen's face crinkled with concern. "That's odd. I saw everyone arriving earlier. The whole family seems to be inside." She paused, studying Margaret's face. "I saw your grandchildren playing in the backyard about an hour ago. They looked so excited, like they were preparing for a celebration." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. The family was already celebrating, without her. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," Margaret said quietly, but even as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't true. The pieces were falling into place now, the changed locks, the unanswered calls, Vanessa's deliberate avoidance. When she'd looked through the window. This wasn't an accident or oversight. This was intentional. Mrs. Chen seemed to sense Margaret's realization. "Would you like to come over for some tea while you sort this out? It's quite warm today." Margaret looked at the house, her son's house, though only she knew a particular truth about its ownership, and felt something harden in her chest. Not anger exactly, but a quiet resolve that matched the strength she'd developed over decades. Of dealing with difficult school boards and challenging parents. "Thank you, but I think I'll wait here," she said, settling onto the porch bench beside her pie. "This is my family's Mother's Day celebration, and I've been looking forward to it for weeks." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly, understanding passing between the two women. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me." As her neighbor walked away, Margaret sat on the bench that had witnessed countless family gatherings, birthday parties, barbecues, holiday celebrations, the house looming before her solid and familiar, filled with people she loved who had decided, for reasons she couldn't yet fathom, that she didn't belong inside. The afternoon sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the porch where she sat surrounded by her purse, the lemon pie, and the growing certainty that this Mother's Day would be unlike any she had experienced before. Inside, she could see the shapes of her family moving through rooms she had helped decorate, around furniture she had helped select, preparing for a celebration of motherhood that somehow excluded the matriarch herself. Margaret pulled her light cardigan tighter against the slight breeze and settled into wait. Behind her designer sunglasses, her eyes remained dry. 35 years as a school principal had taught her how to maintain composure in the face of unexpected crises. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break down, not when they eventually opened the door, and certainly not while sitting alone on her son's porch. As the minutes stretched into a full hour, Margaret began to notice neighbors glancing in her direction as they walked dogs or watered lawns. The Mother's Day exile was becoming a public spectacle, a neighborhood curiosity. She sat straighter, her posture a testament to the dignity she refused to surrender. Her mind raced through possible explanations, searching for anything that might justify her family's behavior. Had she said something offensive at their last gathering? Had she overstepped boundaries with her grandchildren? Had her recent dating life after 3 years of widowhood somehow upset the delicate family balance? None of these possibilities seemed substantial enough to warrant such a dramatic exclusion, especially on Mother's Day of all days. The sound of childish laughter floated from the backyard, piercing Margaret's heart more effectively than any angry words could have. Those were her grandchildren, 10-year-old Sophie and 7-year-old Max, celebrating a day meant to honor her, completely unaware that their grandmother sat alone on the front porch, uninvited and unwelcome. Margaret's phone buzzed again. Another text from Olivia, "Just arrived at Eric's. Where are you? Everyone's asking." The message sent a chill through Margaret's body despite the warm May afternoon. Either Olivia was part of the deception, pretending not to know her mother was locked outside, or she genuinely didn't realize what Eric and Vanessa had done. Neither possibility offered much comfort. She typed back carefully, "I'm outside. The door is locked, and my key doesn't work. No one is answering when I knock." 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, Olivia's response came through, "What? That can't be right. Let me check." A moment later, the front door swung open, and Margaret found herself face to face with her daughter. Olivia's expression shifted from confusion to shock as she took in the sight of her mother sitting on the porch bench, the lemon pie still in its container beside her. "Mom? What are you doing out here? We've been waiting for you to arrive." Olivia's voice carried the genuine surprise of someone who hadn't been part of the plan. Before Margaret could respond, Eric appeared in the doorway behind his sister. Unlike Olivia, there was no surprise in his expression, only a grim resignation that confirmed everything Margaret had suspected during her hour-long vigil. "Eric," Margaret said simply, her voice steady despite the obvious strain of the morning. "I was beginning to wonder if something had happened to all of you." Her son couldn't meet her gaze directly, instead his eyes focused on the potted plants flanking the door as if they might offer some escape from this confrontation. "Mom, we need to talk," he said finally. "I gathered that much when I found myself locked out of a Mother's Day celebration in my honor," Margaret replied, the slight edge in her voice the only indication of the hurt she was carefully containing. Olivia's head swiveled between her mother and brother, confusion giving way to dawning horror. "Eric, what's going on? Please tell me you didn't deliberately." "It's complicated, Liv," Eric cut her off, running a hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. "Mom, can we talk privately?" Margaret stood up from the bench, smoothing the wrinkles from her lavender dress with the deliberate movements of someone buying time to collect their thoughts. "I think we're well past privacy, Eric. Half the neighborhood has watched me sitting out here for the past hour while my family celebrates Mother's Day without me." As if to underscore her point, Mrs. Chen appeared on her own porch across the street, not even pretending not to watch the unfolding drama. Eric's jaw clenched, but he stepped aside, holding the door open in a gesture that felt more like surrender than welcome. "Please come in," he said, the words carrying none of the warmth one would expect from a son to his mother on this particular Sunday in May. As Margaret crossed the threshold into the house that held so many memories, holidays, birthdays, quiet evenings spent with her grandchildren, she could feel the weight of every eye in the room. The conversation that had been flowing freely moments before went silent as heads turned toward the entryway. Vanessa stood frozen by the dining room table, a serving dish in her hands and an expression that fluctuated between defiance and discomfort. Margaret's son-in-law Marcus rose halfway from his chair, clearly unsure whether to greet her or remain seated in the suddenly charged atmosphere. Her grandchildren, initially racing toward the door with excited cries of "Grandma," slowed their approach as they sensed the tension among the adults. But it was the presence of a woman Margaret didn't recognize, elegant in an expensive dress, perhaps in her late 40s, that finally provided a clue to the bizarre situation. She sat at the head of the table, in what would traditionally have been Margaret's place as the matriarch of the family. The stranger's manicured hand rested possessively on the arm of Margaret's ex-husband, Daniel, who had the grace to look deeply uncomfortable as his former wife of 30 years entered the room. "Hello, Margaret," Daniel said, breaking the suffocating silence. "You're looking well." The simple greeting, so inadequate to the moment, hung in the air between them. Margaret took in the scene with the careful assessment of someone who had managed school crises for decades: her ex-husband, his new wife, her children and their spouses, her grandchildren, all gathered for a Mother's Day celebration from which she had been deliberately excluded. "I wish I could say the same for all of you," Margaret replied evenly. "Would someone care to explain why I've been sitting outside for the past hour while you celebrate Mother's Day without the mother?" The room remained painfully silent until Sophie, with the beautiful honesty of childhood, broke the impasse. "Grandma, why are you late? Daddy said you weren't coming because you were too busy with your new boyfriend." The 10-year-old's voice carried clearly through the hushed room. Margaret's eyes snapped to Eric, who had the decency to flinch under her gaze. "Did he now?" she said quietly. "How interesting, considering the text message invitation I received specifically asking me to bring my lemon meringue pie for a 2 p.m. Mother's Day celebration." Olivia stepped forward, her expression a mixture of confusion and growing anger. "Eric, what is going on? You told us Mom had other plans today and would be joining us later." Before Eric could respond, Vanessa cleared her throat. "We thought it would be easier this way," she said, her voice carrying a defensive edge. "With Diane here as Daniel's wife, having both mothers present seemed complicated. We were going to call you for dessert, Margaret. That's why we asked for the pie." "I see," Margaret said, though in truth, the explanation only deepened her confusion and hurt. "So I was relegated to dessert status, while Daniel's new wife takes my place at my family's Mother's Day table." "Mom, it's not like that," Eric began, but the excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Then what is it like, Eric?" Margaret asked, her principal's voice emerging, the tone that had made generations of students stand a little straighter in school hallways. "Please explain to me why my key no longer works in this door, why I was left sitting on the porch for an hour, and why my grandchildren were told I was too busy with a new boyfriend to attend my own Mother's Day celebration." The silence that followed her questions was damning. No one, not even Vanessa, seemed able to provide a justification that wouldn't sound exactly like what it was: a deliberate, hurtful exclusion. Margaret's gaze swept the room, taking in each family member in turn. Her daughter Olivia looked mortified, clearly having been kept in the dark about the plan. Marcus appeared deeply uncomfortable, shifting in his seat as if contemplating an escape route. Daniel couldn't meet her eyes, finding the pattern in the tablecloth suddenly fascinating. Only Diane, the new wife, maintained eye contact, her expression a mixture of triumph and discomfort. "Well," Margaret said finally, "I can see I've interrupted what must be a lovely celebration. Perhaps it would be best if I left you to it." She turned toward the door, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Grandma, no." Max's voice broke through the tension as he rushed forward, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You can't go. It's Mother's Day, and you're the best grandma." Sophie joined her brother, her young face creased with confusion and distress. "Please stay, Grandma. I made you a card and everything." The simple loyalty of her grandchildren, untainted by the adult complications that had led to this moment, nearly broke Margaret's carefully maintained composure. She knelt down to their level, looking into their eyes with a gentle smile that didn't quite mask the pain beneath. "I would love nothing more than to stay with you both," she said softly. "But I think the grown-ups have some things to work out first." "Margaret," Daniel finally spoke up, his voice carrying the awkward authority of someone trying to manage a situation spinning beyond his control. "Perhaps we could all sit down and discuss this like adults." Margaret straightened, meeting her ex-husband's gaze directly for the first time. "Like adults? Is that what you call changing locks and lying to children about why their grandmother isn't present for Mother's Day? Is that your definition of adult behavior, Daniel?" Before he could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Glancing at the screen, Margaret saw it was Richard, the new boyfriend her grandchildren had mentioned, though at 64, the retired judge was hardly a boy, and after 8 months of dating, not particularly new either. "Excuse me," she said, "it seems my other plans are calling." She stepped back onto the porch to take the call, leaving her family in uncomfortable silence behind her. "Richard," she answered, her voice steady despite the emotional storm raging within. "You'll never believe what I've walked into." Richard's voice came through the phone with the calm reassurance that had first drawn Margaret to him 8 months ago. "Margaret, what's happening? Are you all right?" "Not exactly," she replied, keeping her voice low as she glanced back through the doorway at her family frozen in tableau-like characters in a particularly uncomfortable play. "I've just discovered I've been deliberately excluded from my own Mother's Day celebration." "They changed the locks, Richard." There was a brief silence as the retired judge processed this information. "Where are you now?" The concern in his voice was evident, but controlled, a professional lifetime of crisis management evident in his tone. "Standing on my son's porch, where I've been for the past hour while they celebrated inside without me." "I'm coming to get you," Richard said immediately. "Text me the address. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone, especially today." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for this man who had unexpectedly entered her life after 3 years of widowhood. She'd resisted dating at first, convinced that at 62, her life as a partner was over. But Richard, with his thoughtful intelligence and quiet support, had gradually shown her that new beginnings were possible at any age. "No," she said after a moment's consideration. "I need to handle this myself. But thank you for offering. Can I call you later?" "Of course. I'll be here whenever you need me." Margaret ended the call and took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders before turning back to face her family. The principal's posture, her former colleagues would have recognized, the stance she took before addressing a particularly difficult situation at school. As she stepped back inside, she found Olivia had moved to stand by the door, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. "Mom," Olivia said quietly, "I had no idea this was happening. Eric told me you had morning plans with Richard and would join us later. I would never have agreed to this." Margaret patted her daughter's arm gently. "I believe you, Olivia." She moved past her daughter to the center of the living room, where she could address everyone present. "Since I appear to be interrupting a celebration to which I wasn't actually invited, I'll make this brief," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had managed school assemblies for decades. "I'd like an explanation, and I'd like it now." Eric stepped forward, though he still couldn't quite meet his mother's eyes. "Mom, we thought it would be easier this way. With Dad bringing Diane, and you seeing Richard now, the dynamics are complicated. So complicated that the solution was to lock your mother out on Mother's Day?" Margaret asked, her voice level despite the hurt underneath. "To lie to my grandchildren about why I wasn't here?" Vanessa moved to stand beside her husband, her hand on his arm in a gesture of support that felt more possessive than comforting. "Margaret, you have to understand. The children get confused with so many different family configurations. We thought having just one maternal figure, would be less complicated for them. The implication, that Margaret was somehow replaceable, interchangeable with Daniel's new wife, hung in the air like an insult too brazen to be spoken aloud. I see, Margaret said after a moment. And which maternal figure did you think would be most appropriate on Mother's Day? The woman who gave birth to and raised your husband, or his father's new wife whom the children have known for less than 2 years? Daniel cleared his throat uncomfortably. Margaret, there's no need to be dramatic. We were going to include you for dessert, as Vanessa said. Dramatic? Margaret's eyebrow arched perfectly, an expression that had quelled many an unruly student. Is that how you characterize my reaction to being locked out of my family's Mother's Day celebration? As dramatic? The room fell silent again, no one able to offer a justification that wouldn't sound exactly like what it was, cruel and thoughtless. Sophie broke the tension, moving to stand beside her grandmother. I saved you a seat, Grandma, she said, pointing to an empty chair beside her own place at the table. I told Daddy you had to sit by me because I made you something special. The simple loyalty of her granddaughter nearly broke Margaret's carefully maintained composure. She knelt down to Sophie's level, smoothing the girl's dark hair away from her face. Thank you, sweetheart. That was very thoughtful of you. Max joined his sister, his 7-year-old face serious with concern. Are you mad at us, Grandma? Not at you, never at you, Margaret assured him, encompassing both children in her gaze. But I am disappointed in the grown-ups today. Rising to her full height, Margaret addressed the adults in the room once more. I think it's best if I leave now. I wouldn't want to disrupt the celebration you've planned. She turned to her grandchildren. Sophie, Max, I'll see you both next weekend, as usual. We can have our own special day then. But Grandma, Sophie protested, you can't leave. It's Mother's Day. The truth of the child's statement hung in the air, indisputable in its simplicity. It was Mother's Day, and Margaret was being asked. No, forced, to leave a celebration of motherhood by the very people whose existence had made her a mother in the first place. Before Margaret could respond, a knock sounded at the still open front door. All heads turned to see Mrs. Chen standing on the threshold, a covered dish in her hands. Excuse me, the elderly neighbor said, her voice carrying the particular blend of politeness and determination that comes with age. I hope I'm not interrupting, but I brought over some of my spring rolls. Margaret mentioned once how much she enjoyed them. The unexpected arrival created a moment of confusion as Eric stepped forward. Mrs. Chen, this isn't really a good time for a neighborhood visit. Mrs. Chen's eyes narrowed slightly behind her glasses. Oh? Is this not a Mother's Day celebration? And is Margaret not the mother being celebrated? The directness of the question, asked with such innocent confusion that only Margaret recognized the deliberate challenge beneath, silenced Eric momentarily. Well, yes, but then I'm sure my spring rolls will be a welcome addition, Mrs. Chen concluded, stepping past Eric into the house with the confidence of someone who had survived the Cultural Revolution and wasn't about to be deterred by suburban family drama. She placed her dish on the buffet table and turned to survey the room, her sharp eyes taking in the tension, the unexpected guest at the head of the table, and Margaret's isolated position by the door. Margaret, Mrs. Chen said warmly, I'm so glad you were finally able to join your family's celebration. I was becoming concerned, seeing you wait outside for so long. The simple statement, delivered with such deliberate emphasis on the word outside, caused a ripple of discomfort through the room. Olivia looked at her mother with renewed horror as the full implications of what had happened sank in. You were waiting outside for an hour, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 1 hour and 17 minutes, to be precise, Margaret confirmed, checking her watch. Mrs. Chen was kind enough to offer me shelter at her home, but I declined. I didn't want to miss any of the Mother's Day celebration I believed I had been invited to. Mrs. Chen nodded sagely. Such dedication. Such maternal devotion. It reminds me of my own mother, who walked 5 miles through a snowstorm to bring me medicine when I was sick as a child. She fixed Eric with a piercing stare. In my culture, mothers are revered, not left sitting on porches. The pointed comment landed like a physical blow. Eric's face flushed deep red, while Vanessa suddenly became very interested in adjusting the flower arrangement on the table. Daniel, who had remained uncomfortably silent during most of the confrontation, finally stood up. Margaret, perhaps we should speak privately. He gestured toward the kitchen, away from the increasingly awkward gathering in the dining room. I think we're well past privacy, Daniel, Margaret replied evenly. Whatever you have to say can be said in front of the family you've assembled here. The challenge hung in the air between them, former partners of 30 years, now facing each other across a divide far wider than the physical space of the dining room. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his silver hair in a gesture so Familiar that Margaret felt an unwelcome pang of recognition. This was never meant to hurt you. We just thought, with the new family arrangements, it would be easier to have separate celebrations. Easier for whom? Margaret asked, her voice carrying just enough edge to make her ex-husband wince. Easier for you and your new wife? Easier for Eric and Vanessa? Because it certainly wasn't easier for me to sit alone on that porch, wondering why my family had locked me out on Mother's Day. Before Daniel could respond, Diane rose from her seat at the head of the table. Her expression carried the particular discomfort of someone who had suddenly realized they had been cast as the villain in a story they hadn't fully understood. Perhaps I should be the one to leave, she suggested, her voice carrying a forced graciousness that didn't quite mask her irritation. This is clearly a family matter that needs to be resolved. You are family now, Diane, Margaret surprised everyone by saying. Daniel made that choice 2 years ago, and I've respected it. What I don't respect is being treated as if I'm disposable, as if 30 years of motherhood can be erased because it's more convenient for everyone's scheduling. The truth of her words silenced the room. Even Mrs. Chen, who had positioned herself strategically by the buffet where she could observe everything, nodded in quiet approval. Max, who had been following the adult conversation with the confused concentration of a child trying to understand complexities beyond his years, suddenly spoke up. If Grandma Margaret leaves, I'm going with her. The simple declaration, made with a child's perfect conviction, cut through the tension like a knife. Me too, Sophie added, moving to stand beside her grandmother with unwavering loyalty. It's not Mother's Day without Grandma Margaret. Margaret felt her carefully maintained composure waver as her grandchildren flanked her, their small hands reaching for hers with complete faith in the rightness of their position. These children, at least, understood what the adults seemed to have forgotten, that some bonds couldn't be restructured for convenience, that some relationships were fundamental and irreplaceable. No one needs to leave, Margaret said finally, looking down at her grandchildren's earnest faces. This day is about celebrating mothers, all mothers. There's room for everyone at the table. She glanced up, meeting Diane's eyes directly for the first time. Even new mothers to the family. The olive branch, extended with such gracious dignity despite her own hurt, seemed to shift something in the atmosphere of the room. Olivia stepped forward, her decision made. Mom's right, she said firmly. This is ridiculous. It's Mother's Day, and we should be celebrating both of the mothers in our family. She turned to Eric, her expression challenging. Unless there's something else going on here that I don't understand. Eric and Vanessa exchanged a glance that didn't escape Margaret's notice, a look loaded with unspoken communication that suggested there was indeed more to the story than a simple desire to avoid complicated family dynamics. Eric, Margaret said quietly. Is there something else you want to tell me? Something beyond the awkwardness of having your father's new wife and your mother at the same table? Her son's inability to meet her gaze confirmed her suspicions. Whatever had led to her exclusion today went deeper than the surface explanations offered so far. Perhaps, Mrs. Chen suggested, with the calm authority of someone who had witnessed generations of family conflicts, we should all sit down together. These matters are better discussed with food and proper seating. The simple, practical suggestion broke the standoff. Reluctantly, everyone began moving toward the dining room table, rearranging themselves to accommodate Margaret. Sophie insisted her grandmother take the seat beside her, which happened to be directly across from Diane, a positioning that created its own silent tension. As dishes were passed and plates were filled, the conversation remained painfully stilted. The children, sensing the adult undercurrents but not understanding them, attempted to fill the silence with stories from school and questions about when they could visit Margaret's apartment next. Margaret answered her grandchildren with genuine warmth, but her attention remained focused on Eric and Vanessa, who continued to exchange loaded glances whenever they thought she wasn't looking. Something was definitely being left unsaid, and Margaret's decades as an educator had taught her to recognize when people were hiding important information. It was during the serving of dessert, ironically, Margaret's lemon meringue pie that had waited with her on the porch, that Olivia finally lost patience with the strained politeness. All right, enough, she said, setting down her fork with a decisiveness that reminded Margaret of herself. Eric, Vanessa, something else is going on here. What aren't you telling us? Eric cleared his throat uncomfortably, glancing at his wife as if seeking permission or support. Vanessa gave a slight nod, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mom, Eric began, his voice carrying a false casualness that immediately put Margaret on alert. We've been meaning to talk to you about the house. The house? Margaret repeated, uncertainty flickering across her face. Which house? This house, Eric clarified, gesturing to the elegant dining room around them. Your house, technically. The clarification sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with the spring breeze coming through the open windows. 5 years ago, when Eric and Vanessa had faced financial difficulties after his startup company failed, Margaret had used her retirement savings to help them purchase this home. The legal arrangement had been clear: she would hold the deed while they paid her back in monthly installments, essentially functioning as their mortgage holder rather than forcing them to deal with bank loans they couldn't qualify for at the time. What about the house? Margaret asked carefully, though a growing sense of dread suggested she already knew the answer. Well, Eric continued, his voice strained with forced optimism, Vanessa and I have been thinking it might be time for a change. The housing market in Henderson is really strong right now, and we could probably get a great price if we decided to sell. The words hung in the air, their full implication slowly sinking in. They wanted to sell her house, the house she legally owned, the house where she had expected to live out her retirement years once Eric and Vanessa had finished paying her back and moved on to something larger for their growing family. I see, Margaret said, her voice so carefully controlled that only Olivia, who knew her mother well, could hear the hurt beneath the calm exterior. And when were you planning to discuss this with me, considering I still hold the deed? Vanessa stepped in, her voice carrying the practiced smoothness of her real estate background. We've been researching the market for months now. Properties in this neighborhood have appreciated significantly. We could all benefit from a sale. You'd get your investment back with considerable interest, and we could move somewhere with better schools for the children. Months? Margaret repeated, the single word carrying the weight of betrayal. You've been planning to sell my house for months without discussing it with me? It's not exactly your house, Mom, Eric said, an edge creeping into his voice. We've been living here, paying you back faithfully every month. We've done all the maintenance, the landscaping, the improvements. For all practical purposes, it's our house. For all practical purposes except the legal one, Margaret pointed out, her principal's voice emerging, calm, authoritative, and brooking no argument. The deed is in my name. That was our agreement when I used my retirement savings to help you. The tension around the table had thickened to an almost unbearable degree. Olivia was staring at her brother with undisguised shock, while Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside her. Daniel and Diane seemed to be attempting to become invisible, clearly regretting their involvement in what had evolved into a family financial confrontation. Only Mrs. Chen appeared completely at ease, calmly eating her spring roll while observing the drama with the interested detachment of someone watching a particularly engaging television show. We were going to tell you, Vanessa insisted, though. Her eyes slid away from Margaret's direct gaze. We just wanted to have all the information first, to present you with a complete picture of the opportunity. The opportunity, Margaret repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. And was locking me out today part of presenting this opportunity? Was excluding me from Mother's Day somehow meant to make me more receptive to hearing you want to sell my house out from under me? Eric had the grace to look ashamed, but Vanessa's expression hardened slightly. That's not fair, Margaret. The timing is unfortunate, but the two things aren't related. Aren't they? Margaret countered. Years of experience dealing with evasive parents and students allowing her to see through the deflection. Then explain to me why my key no longer works in a house that I legally own. The question landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of uncomfortable silence that spread throughout the room. Even the children had gone quiet, sensing the serious shift in the conversation. We changed the locks last week, Eric finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. After our discussion about Richard. What discussion about Richard? Margaret asked, genuinely confused. When you mentioned him moving in with you, Vanessa supplied, a hint of accusation in her tone. We were concerned about what that might mean for our arrangement with the house. Margaret stared at them in genuine bewilderment. I never said Richard was moving in with me. I mentioned he was helping me look at retirement communities for the future, years in the future, when I'm ready to downsize. The misunderstanding hung in the air, but Margaret could see from Eric and Vanessa's expressions that it had merely been a convenient excuse, not the real reason behind their actions. So you changed the locks on my house, she said slowly, making sure everyone at the table could follow the implications, because you thought my dating life might somehow threaten your living situation. And then you excluded me from Mother's Day because, why, exactly? To avoid having a difficult conversation about the house you've been planning to sell without my knowledge or consent. Put so plainly, the actions seemed indefensible. Eric stared down at his plate, unable to meet his mother's eyes, while Vanessa's mouth formed a tight, defensive line. Olivia, who had been listening with increasing horror, finally spoke up. Eric, please tell me this isn't what it sounds like. Please tell me you didn't lock Mom out on Mother's Day because you're trying to manipulate her regarding the house. When Eric remained silent, the answer became clear to everyone at the table. Margaret set her napkin down beside her plate with the careful precision of someone making a decision. "I think it's time for me to leave," she said quietly, rising from her chair. "Sophie, Max, thank you for wanting me to be part of your Mother's Day. That means more to me than you can know." "Mom, wait," Eric started, but Margaret held up a hand to silence him. "I've heard enough for today, Eric. We'll discuss the house situation another time, when I've had a chance to review the legal documents and consult with my attorney." The mention of an attorney wasn't lost on anyone at the table. This had moved beyond a family disagreement into something with potential legal consequences. As Margaret gathered her purse, Mrs. Chen also rose from her seat. "I'll walk out with you, Margaret," she said, her voice carrying the particular authority of elderly Asian women that brooked no argument. "The spring air will do us both good. After such a stimulating meal." The two women moved toward the door, leaving a table of stunned family members behind them. Only Sophie and Max rushed after their grandmother, throwing their arms around her waist in fierce hugs of farewell. "Will you still take us to the museum next weekend?" Max asked anxiously, his 7-year-old face creased with worry. Margaret knelt down to his level, looking into eyes so like her own. "Of course I will. Nothing that happened today changes how much I love you." As she straightened up, her gaze swept the dining room one last time, taking in her family frozen in various states of discomfort and regret. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of a woman who had spent decades managing difficult situations with grace and authority. "I raised you better than this," she said simply, the words directed primarily at Eric but encompassing everyone present. "And I deserve better than this." With that, Margaret walked out the front door, her head held high and her dignity intact, though her heart felt shattered into pieces that she wasn't sure could ever be reassembled. The May afternoon sunlight had taken on the golden quality of early evening by the time Margaret and Mrs. Chen reached the sidewalk. For several moments, both women walked in silence, the only sound the gentle click of Margaret's heels against the concrete and the distant laughter of neighborhood children playing in nearby yards. "In my 70 years, Mrs. Chen finally said, her voice carrying the particular wisdom of someone who had survived revolution, immigration, and the raising of 4 successful children, "I have never understood why Americans make family matters so complicated." Despite everything, Margaret found herself smiling slightly. "And Chinese families don't have complications?" Mrs. Chen waved a dismissive hand. "Of course we do. But we would never lock a mother out on Mother's Day. Some things are sacred." She paused at the edge of her own driveway. "Would you like to come in for real tea? Not that colored water they were serving in there." The simple offer of genuine hospitality after an afternoon of rejection brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, but not before Mrs. Chen noticed. "Yes," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tea would be lovely." Mrs. Chen's home was exactly what Margaret would have expected, immaculately kept, with a blend of traditional Chinese decorative elements and practical American furniture. Family photographs covered one entire wall of the living room, generations of Chens staring out from carefully arranged frames. Sit," Mrs. Chen instructed, gesturing to a comfortable armchair while she disappeared into the kitchen. Family issues should never be discussed without proper tea. Left alone, Margaret found herself staring at the photo wall, taking in the faces of strangers who nevertheless seemed familiar in their family poses: graduations, weddings, new babies, holiday gatherings. The visual testament to continuity and connection made her own family's fractures feel even more painful by comparison. Mrs. Chen returned carrying a tray with an ornate teapot and 2 delicate cups without handles. "My grandmother's," she explained, seeing Margaret's admiring glance at the porcelain. "One of the few things I was able to bring when we left China. Some treasures are worth protecting, no matter what else must be left behind." The subtle wisdom in the statement wasn't lost on Margaret. As a retired educator, she recognized a teaching moment when she encountered one, even when she was the intended student. "Your family," Margaret gestured to the photo wall as Mrs. Chen poured the fragrant tea. "They all seem so connected." "Connected, yes. Perfect, no." Mrs. Chen handed Margaret a cup with a small smile. "My oldest son didn't speak to me for 3 years after I told him his first wife was wrong for him. I was right, of course, she left him for his business partner, but being right didn't make those 3 years of silence any easier." Margaret sipped the tea, appreciating both its complex flavor and the story behind it. "How did you reconcile?" "His second wife arranged it. A wise woman who understood that family ties may stretch, but should never break." Mrs. Chen settled into her own chair with the ease of someone comfortable with difficult conversations. "Now, tell me about this house situation. Not as a neighbor who was eavesdropping, though I admit I was, but as someone who has navigated family property disputes before." Perhaps it was the tea, Or perhaps it was simply the relief of speaking to someone who had no stake in the family drama, but Margaret found herself explaining the entire situation, how she had used a significant portion of her retirement savings to help Eric and Vanessa purchase the house when they were in financial trouble, how the legal arrangement had always been clear that she retained ownership while they made monthly payments to her, and how she had planned to transfer the deed once they had repaid the full amount. "I never imagined they would try to sell it," Margaret concluded, staring into her teacup as if it might contain answers. "Especially not without discussing it with me first." Mrs. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Money and property reveal character like nothing else. In difficult times, we learn who people truly are." "I thought I knew who my son was," Margaret said quietly. "Perhaps you still do," Mrs. Chen suggested. "Perhaps this is not about who he is, but about who his wife wishes him to be." The observation struck Margaret with unexpected force. She had noticed, of course, the way Vanessa seemed to dominate their conversations, the way Eric looked to his wife before answering questions, the subtle shifts in his behavior when Vanessa expressed disapproval. But she had attributed it to the natural adjustments of marriage, not to something more concerning. "You think Vanessa is behind this?" Margaret asked, though she already suspected the answer. "I think," Mrs. Chen said carefully, "that your son would never have thought to lock his mother out on Mother's Day on his own. Such calculated cruelty requires a different kind of thinking." Before Margaret could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming text. It was from Olivia. "Mom, where are you? I've left Eric's house. We need to talk." Margaret showed the message to Mrs. Chen, who nodded decisively. "Tell her to come here. Family matters should be discussed with proper tea and a neutral observer." 20 minutes later, Olivia arrived at Mrs. Chen's house, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and distress. After introductions and another round of tea, Olivia got straight to the point. "Mom, I had no idea what they were planning. About Mother's Day or about the house. I would never have participated if I'd known." Her voice carried the genuine regret of someone discovering they had been an unwitting accomplice to cruelty. "I believe you," Margaret said simply. "But I'm still trying to understand why. Why the secrecy? Why the locked door?" "Eric and Vanessa have always been welcome to discuss any concerns about our arrangement." Olivia hesitated, clearly weighing her loyalties as a daughter against her obligations as a sister. Finally, she sighed deeply. "It's more complicated than just wanting to sell the house. Vanessa's been talking to a developer who's buying up properties in the neighborhood for some kind of luxury condominium project. The offer they're considering is substantially above market value." The revelation sent a chill through Margaret. This wasn't just about a family moving to a better school district or upgrading to a larger home. This was about a significant financial opportunity that her son and daughter-in-law had deliberately hidden from her, one that would profit them greatly while potentially leaving her without the retirement security she had carefully planned. "How much more than market value?" Margaret asked, her business acumen, honed through decades of managing school budgets, coming to the forefront. "Nearly double, from what Eric let slip after you left." Olivia shook her head in disbelief. "They could walk away with enough to buy a new house outright and still have a substantial profit." "But Mom, that's your money. Your investment. They can't possibly think they have the right to, but they do think that," Margaret interrupted, pieces clicking into place. "They've convinced themselves that their monthly payments and maintenance of the property somehow entitle them to the full appreciation value, regardless of whose money actually purchased the house." Mrs. Chen, who had been quietly observing this exchange, nodded sagely. "As I said, money reveals character." Olivia leaned forward, her expression earnest. "What are you going to do, Mom? Eric mentioned you talking about an attorney." Margaret was silent for a moment, considering her options. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple family disagreement. This was about her financial security, her legal rights, and most painfully, about the clear demonstration that her son and daughter-in-law were willing to manipulate and exclude her for their own gain. "I don't know yet," she admitted finally. "I need to review the legal documents, consult with my attorney, and—" She trailed off, the weight of what she was considering settling heavily on her shoulders. "And decide whether your relationship with your son is worth salvaging, Mrs. Chen finished for her, the directness of the statement causing both Margaret and Olivia to look at her in surprise. The elderly woman shrugged unapologetically. "At my age, there is no time for polite evasions. Some betrayals cut too deeply to heal." The truth of the statement hung in the air between them. Margaret had faced many challenges in her life. The early death of her husband, raising 2 children as a single mother while building her career in education, navigating the complexities of co-parenting with Daniel after their divorce. But she had never imagined that her retirement years would include defending herself against her own son's attempts to appropriate her financial resources. "I should get back," Olivia said finally, checking her watch. "Marcus is probably wondering where I am. But Mom, whatever you decide to do about the house, I'm with you." What they did today was unforgivable. After Olivia left, Margaret remained at Mrs. Chen's table, staring into her now cold tea. "I should go as well," she said finally. "I've imposed on your kindness long enough." "Nonsense," Mrs. Chen replied firmly. "You will stay for dinner. I have a nephew visiting tomorrow who is an excellent real estate attorney. Perhaps you would like to return and speak with him?" The practical offer of help, presented without pity or excessive sympathy, was exactly what Margaret needed. "That would be very helpful, thank you." As they prepared a simple dinner together, moving around Mrs. Chen's kitchen with the easy coordination of women who had each managed households for decades, Margaret felt some of her equilibrium returning. The betrayal still stung, perhaps. It always would, but the fog of confusion and hurt was gradually being replaced by clarity and determination. By the time she returned to her own apartment that evening, Margaret had made her decision. The Mother's Day debacle had revealed something essential about her relationship with Eric and Vanessa, something she couldn't ignore or excuse away. Some doors, once locked against you, should remain closed, not out of bitterness or revenge, but out of self-preservation and self-respect. The following morning, Margaret woke early, made herself a strong cup of coffee, and called Richard. The retired judge listened without interruption as she explained everything that had happened, and what she intended to do. "Are you sure about this?" he asked when she had finished. "It's a significant step." "I've never been more certain of anything," Margaret replied, her voice steady with conviction. "Will you help me?" "Of course," Richard said without hesitation. "I'll make some calls this morning." By noon, Margaret had spoken with both her financial advisor and a real estate attorney recommended by Richard. By 3 in the afternoon, she had reviewed the original purchase agreement for the house and confirmed what she already knew. Legally, she was on solid ground. By 5, she had drafted the letter that would forever change her relationship with her son. Mrs. Chen's nephew, James Chen, arrived as promised the next day. Over another pot of his aunt's excellent tea, he reviewed Margaret's situation and the steps she had already taken. "Your position is clear," he confirmed, his professional demeanor softened by genuine concern. "But are you prepared for how your son might react? These situations can become contentious." "I'm prepared," Margaret said simply. There was no need to explain further. As a principal who had managed difficult parents, challenging students, and complicated community politics for over 3 decades, she was well versed in handling conflict. The fact that this particular conflict involved her own son made it painful, but not unnavigable. "Then I'd be honored to represent you," James said, accepting the folder of documents Margaret had prepared. "My aunt speaks very highly of you." "Your aunt," Margaret replied with a small smile, "is a remarkable woman who appeared exactly when I needed a friend." Mrs. Chen, who had been pretending not to listen from the kitchen, called out, "In Chinese, we have a saying, a good neighbor is better than a distant relative. But sometimes, a good neighbor becomes like family." The sentiment warmed Margaret's heart even as she prepared for the difficult steps ahead. By the end of the week, everything was in place. The certified letters had been sent, the legal documentation filed, and Margaret's new path forward carefully mapped out. It was on Friday afternoon, exactly 5 days after the Mother's Day disaster, that the expected call from Eric finally came through. Margaret had been working in her small garden on the apartment balcony when her phone buzzed. She wiped her hands on her gardening apron before answering, her voice calm and professional. "Hello, Eric." "Mom, what is this?" His voice carried the particular outrage of someone who had expected to maintain control of a situation only to discover they never had it to begin with. "We just received legal papers from some attorney saying you're exercising your right to sell the house? That we have 60 days to vacate or purchase at full market value?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed, her tone carrying decades of administrative authority. "That's correct. But you can't do this." The panic in Eric's voice was evident now. "We have children, schools, our whole lives are established here." "I understand that," Margaret replied, keeping her voice level despite the turmoil of emotions beneath. "Which is why I've given you the option to purchase the house yourselves at current market value, not the inflated developer price you were planning to accept without consulting me." The silence that followed confirmed what Margaret had already known. They had indeed been planning to sell to the developer, probably pocketing the difference between what they owed her and the substantial offer they'd received. "Mom," Eric's voice had shifted to the cajoling tone he'd used since childhood when trying to get his way. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. We were always going to make sure you got your investment back. We just thought that you Could make decisions about my property without involving me? Margaret finished for him. That you could lock me out on Mother's Day rather than have an honest conversation? That my financial security was less important than your opportunity for profit? It wasn't like that, Eric protested, though his voice lacked conviction. It was exactly like that, Margaret replied firmly. And it has shown me something important about our relationship, something I can't ignore. What are you saying? Eric's voice had grown quieter, perhaps sensing the finality in his mother's tone. Margaret took a deep breath, centering herself for the words she had rehearsed but had hoped never to speak. I'm saying that I've made my decision. The house will be sold either to you and Vanessa at fair market value, or to another buyer. If you choose not to purchase it, the proceeds will secure my retirement and allow me to create trusts for Sophie and Max's education. And what about us? The question carried a vulnerability that might have swayed Margaret a week earlier. That's up to you, she replied honestly. I will always be your mother, Eric. I will always love you. But I will no longer allow myself to be manipulated, excluded, or taken advantage of, not even by my own children. So you're punishing us? Throwing us out of our home because of one mistake? The accusation held echoes of the teenage boy who had never fully accepted responsibility for his actions. No, Eric. I'm protecting myself because I've realized no one else will. Not you, not Vanessa, not even your father. Margaret's voice remained steady, though her heart ached with the truth of what she was saying. You locked me out on Mother's Day, but in doing so, you showed me exactly where I stand in your priorities. I'm simply responding accordingly. By locking us out forever? The phrase from her certified letter, clear, legal language about terminating their residency, thrown back at her with bitter emphasis. By establishing boundaries that should have been clear from the beginning, Margaret corrected. By ensuring that my retirement isn't compromised by your decisions. By showing my grandchildren that self-respect matters, even when it's difficult. There was silence on the line for several long moments. When Eric spoke again, his voice carried a resignation that suggested he finally understood the irrevocable nature of what had happened. Vanessa won't accept this. She'll want to fight it. That's her choice, Margaret replied calmly. But as Mr. Chen has explained, the legal situation is quite clear. My documentation is thorough, the deed is in my name, and your payment history establishes our arrangement as a rent-to-own agreement that I have the right to terminate with proper notice, which I've now provided. The mention of James Chen seemed to deflate the last of Eric's resistance. You've really thought this through. I've had to, Margaret said simply. You left me no choice. After ending the call, Margaret sat quietly on her balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. There was grief in her heart, how could there not be? But also a surprising sense of liberation. For decades, she had prioritized her children's needs, their comfort, their security. Even after they were grown, she had continued to place their interests above her own, offering financial support, childcare, and unconditional love without expecting anything in return. But the Mother's Day lockout had forced her to recognize an uncomfortable truth, that her generosity had been taken for granted, her boundaries ignored, and her role in the family reduced to what she could provide rather than who she was. In standing up for herself now, in asserting her legal rights and her personal dignity, she wasn't just securing her financial future, she was reclaiming her identity as a woman worthy of respect, not just as a mother. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. How did it go? Margaret smiled slightly as she typed her response, exactly as expected. Dinner tomorrow? His reply came quickly. I'll pick you up at 7. Proud of you. The simple affirmation warmed her heart. Richard understood what she was doing and why, not because he was taking her side against her family, but because he recognized that sometimes, self-respect required difficult choices. As the evening shadows lengthened across her small balcony garden, Margaret thought about the lessons she hoped her grandchildren might learn from this situation someday, when they were old enough to understand. That love didn't mean allowing yourself to be mistreated. That generosity shouldn't leave you vulnerable. That even at 62, it wasn't too late to stand up for yourself and chart a new course. The thought of Sophie and Max brought a fresh wave of sadness. They were innocent in all of this, and yet they would inevitably be affected by the fracture between their grandmother and their parents. Margaret had already decided that she would do everything possible to maintain her relationship with them, even if it meant coordinating with Olivia for visits or meeting at neutral locations until the housing situation was resolved. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Olivia. Mom, her daughter said as soon as Margaret answered. I just heard from Eric. Is it true? Are you really selling the house? Yes, Margaret confirmed. I've given them the option to purchase it themselves at market value, but if they choose not to, it will be listed next month. Olivia was quiet for a moment, processing this information. I understand why you're doing this, she said finally. After what happened on Mother's Day, but Mom, it's going to get ugly. Vanessa is already talking about contesting it, claiming they had a verbal agreement with you about eventual ownership. They're welcome to try, Margaret replied, the principal's voice emerging again, calm, authoritative, and absolutely certain. But Mr. Chen has assured me that the documentation is clear. My retirement savings purchased that house. The deed is in my name. Their monthly payments to me were clearly designated as a private mortgage arrangement, not rent building equity. I know, Olivia sighed. I hate seeing the family torn apart like this. The family was already torn apart, Margaret said gently. When they decided to lock me out on Mother's Day rather than have an honest conversation. When they planned to sell my property without consulting me. When they chose convenience and profit over respect and honesty. The truth of her words hung in the air between them. After a moment, Olivia spoke again, her voice carrying a new resolve. You're right. And I want you to know that whatever happens with Eric and Vanessa, Marcus and I are behind you. What they did was wrong, and you deserve better. Thank you, sweetheart, Margaret said, touched by her daughter's loyalty. That means more than you know. After ending the call, Margaret sat watching the last light fade from the sky, stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be legal challenges, emotional confrontations, painful adjustments to new family dynamics. But for the first time in years, perhaps decades, Margaret felt fully in control of her own life, her own decisions, her own future. She had spent a lifetime nurturing others, supporting their dreams, helping them navigate challenges. Now, in what she had once thought would be the quiet sunset years of her life, she was discovering a new kind of strength, not the nurturing, accommodating strength of motherhood, but the clear-eyed, boundary-setting strength of a woman who finally understood her own worth. They had locked her out on Mother's Day, never imagining that in doing so, they had unlocked something powerful within her, a determination to never again allow herself to be diminished, manipulated, or taken for granted, even by those she loved most in the world. 3 months after the Mother's Day lockout, Margaret Reynolds stood in the gleaming lobby of Desert Sunrise Senior Living, clipboard in hand as she directed a team of movers with the same efficient authority she had once used to organize school assemblies. The retirement community, with its adobe-inspired architecture and carefully landscaped desert gardens, represented not the diminishment she had once feared but a deliberate choice, a new chapter written entirely on her own terms. Ms. Reynolds, where would you like the bookcase? One of the movers gestured toward the solid oak piece that had once graced her family home's living room. Against the east wall, please, Margaret replied, consulting her meticulously drawn floor plan. And the desk will go by the window. Her new apartment was smaller than the family home she had shared with Daniel during their marriage, but considerably more spacious than the rental she had occupied after their divorce. 2 bedrooms, one for herself and one that could accommodate visiting grandchildren, plus a study where she could pursue the memoir writing she had postponed for decades. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the community gardens, and a private balcony offered views of the distant mountains. It's absolutely perfect, Mrs. Chen declared, arriving with 2 cups of tea in travel mugs. She handed one to Margaret with a satisfied nod. Much better than that dreary apartment complex. In the 3 months since the Mother's Day confrontation, Lily Chen had appointed herself Margaret's unofficial support coordinator, advisor, and most stalwart defender. The friendship that had begun with spring rolls and sympathy had deepened into something Margaret treasured, an alliance between women who understood that age brought not just wisdom but a clarifying perspective on what truly mattered in life. It's certainly an upgrade, Margaret agreed, accepting the tea gratefully. The past months had been a whirlwind of legal consultations, property appraisals, financial reorganization, and emotional reckonings. Through it all, the tea ritual she had adopted from Mrs. Chen had become a centering practice, a moment of calm amid the storm of transformation. Have you heard from Eric? Mrs. Chen asked, never one to dance around difficult subjects. Margaret shook her head. Not since the closing last week. Olivia tells me they've put a deposit on a house in Green Valley. Smaller than they wanted, but within their budget once they paid me the market value for the property. After the initial shock and anger, Eric and Vanessa had ultimately chosen to purchase the house themselves rather than risk losing it entirely. The developer's offer had mysteriously evaporated once word spread that the property's ownership was in dispute, something Margaret suspected might have been Richard's doing, though he never confirmed her suspicions. Without the inflated developer price to fuel their ambitions, Eric and Vanessa had been forced to face financial reality. They could afford to buy Margaret out at fair market value, but doing so would require scaling back their dreams of a luxury upgrade. And the grandchildren? Mrs. Chen's question carried genuine concern. During the legal negotiations, Margaret's access to Sophie and Max had been severely restricted, with Vanessa insisting that any visits be supervised at neutral locations. "I'm seeing them this weekend," Margaret replied, unable to keep the smile from her voice. "Olivia is bringing them to help me arrange my new bookshelves. Sophie's very excited about organizing my novels alphabetically by author." The arrangement wasn't ideal. Margaret missed the casual, spontaneous visits and overnight stays that had once been part of her relationship with her grandchildren, but it was a beginning, a foundation upon which to rebuild. "Good, good." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "Children need their grandmother. Even if their parents are." She trailed off, leaving the assessment of Eric and Vanessa diplomatically unspoken. As the movers continued bringing in furniture and boxes, Margaret allowed herself a moment to reflect on the journey that had led her to this point. The Mother's Day lockout had been devastating in the moment, a public humiliation, a family betrayal, a painful reckoning with how her own children viewed her worth and place in their lives. Yet standing in her new home, surrounded by carefully chosen furnishings and with a financial future now secure thanks to her insistence on fair compensation for the house, she recognized that the lockout had been not an ending but a beginning. The doorbell chimed, interrupting her reflection. Margaret opened the door to find Richard standing there, impeccable in a light summer suit despite the Nevada heat, a bottle of champagne in one hand and a small gift bag in the other. "Housewarming," he explained, stepping inside and taking in the half-furnished apartment with an appreciative eye. "Or apartment warming, I suppose." "Richard." Mrs. Chen greeted him with the particular enthusiasm she reserved for those she considered worthy allies. "Just in time to help with the heavy lifting." The retired judge laughed good-naturedly. "At my age, the only heavy lifting I do is with legal briefs, but I'm happy to direct operations if needed." The easy camaraderie between them warmed Margaret's heart. Richard had been her rock throughout the legal process, not by fighting her battles for her but by connecting her with the right resources and offering the quiet support of someone who understood that standing up for yourself wasn't about revenge but about self-respect. As the afternoon progressed, the apartment gradually transformed from an empty space into the beginnings of a home. Mrs. Chen supervised the arrangement of the kitchen with military precision, insisting that spices be organized by cuisine type, rather than alphabetically. Richard assembled the small dining set that would replace the formal dining room table Margaret had left behind, his methodical approach reminding her of why he had been such an effective judge. And Margaret herself moved from room to room, placing the photographs and mementos that would make this new space truly hers. One photograph in particular gave her pause, a family portrait taken at Sophie's birthday 3 years earlier, everyone smiling beneath the Nevada sun, united in celebration. Margaret studied the faces captured in that moment of harmony, Eric with his arm around Vanessa, Max on Daniel's shoulders, Olivia and Marcus standing close together, and Margaret herself in the center, surrounded by the family she had nurtured and loved. "Shall I put this one away?" Richard asked gently, noticing her hesitation. Margaret considered the question seriously. It would be easier, perhaps, to erase these visual reminders of what had been lost, to focus only on moving forward. But that had never been her approach to life's challenges, not as a young widow raising children alone, not as a school principal navigating difficult community dynamics, and not now as a woman redefining her place in her family and the world. "No," she decided firmly. "It stays." That moment was real, even if what came after was painful. "I won't erase the good memories because of the difficult ones." Richard squeezed her shoulder in silent understanding. It was one of the qualities she most appreciated about him, his ability to respect her decisions without feeling the need to fix or manage her emotions. By early evening, the major furniture was arranged, the kitchen essentials unpacked, and the bedroom set up enough for comfortable sleeping. Mrs. Chen declared herself satisfied with the progress and departed with promises to return the next day with proper housewarming food, not that takeout nonsense. Alone with Richard, Margaret stepped out onto her new balcony, taking in the desert sunset painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. The mountains in the distance stood like silent sentinels, ancient and unchanging amid human dramas. "It's quite a view," Richard commented, joining her with 2 glasses of the champagne he'd brought. "It is," Margaret agreed, accepting a glass. "Different from what I'm used to, but beautiful in its own way." The metaphor wasn't lost on either of them. At 62, Margaret had embarked on a life she had never envisioned for herself, not just the new living arrangement, but the fundamental shift in her family relationships, her sense of self, and her vision for the future. "To new beginnings," Richard offered, raising his glass. "And to standing your ground," Margaret added, clinking her glass against his. The champagne was excellent, crisp and perfectly chilled, a small luxury that represented the careful balance she was learning to strike between prudent financial management and deserved indulgence. As they stood watching the sunset, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The pain of the Mother's Day betrayal hadn't disappeared, perhaps it never would entirely, but it had been transformed into something else, a catalyst for growth, a clarifying moment that had revealed both painful truths and unexpected strengths. "I had dinner with James Chen last week," Richard mentioned casually. "He tells me Eric and Vanessa have been making inquiries about contesting the sale, claiming some kind of verbal agreement about inheritance rights." Margaret sighed, unsurprised but disappointed nonetheless. "James already warned me they might try something like that." "What did he advise?" "He says their case has no legal merit," Richard replied. "The documentation is clear, and your actions throughout have been by the book. But he did suggest documenting any contact with them from now on, just to be safe." The recommendation was prudent but painful, further evidence of how fundamentally her relationship with her son had changed. Once, she would have trusted Eric implicitly. Now, she needed to protect herself from his potential manipulations. "I'll be seeing Sophie and Max this weekend," Margaret said, her thoughts turning to her grandchildren. "I want to keep things positive for them. They shouldn't have to carry the weight of adult conflicts." Richard nodded approvingly. "That's wise. Children are remarkably resilient, but they're also sensitive to undercurrents between the adults they love." As a family court judge for over 20 years, Richard had seen firsthand the impact of family fractures on children. His guidance on navigating the complex new dynamics with her grandchildren had been invaluable, practical without being cold, compassionate without encouraging martyrdom. "I've been thinking," Margaret said, turning slightly to face him in the fading light, "about starting a scholarship fund with part of the proceeds from the house sale for single parents pursuing education degrees." Richard's smile was warm with understanding. "Honoring your own journey while creating opportunity for others. I think that's a wonderful idea." The idea had come to Margaret during one of her early morning meditation sessions, another practice she had adopted in the months since Mother's Day. Using a portion of the money to establish a legacy that reflected her values felt right. A way of transforming what had begun as pain into something that would benefit others. "I'll need some legal advice on setting it up properly," she continued. "Tax implications, administration, that sort of thing." "I know just the person," Richard replied. "A former colleague who specializes in charitable foundations. I'll put you in touch." This was their pattern now, Margaret making her own decisions, Richard offering support and connections when needed but never attempting to take control or direct her choices. It was a partnership of equals, something she had rarely experienced in her previous relationships. As darkness fell, they moved back inside, where Richard helped her unpack a few more essential boxes before preparing to leave. At the door, he paused, reaching for her hand. "I'm proud of you, Margaret. What you've accomplished these past few months, it's remarkable." The simple affirmation touched her deeply. Not because she needed external validation, but because it acknowledged the genuine strength it had taken to stand up for herself, to demand respect, to rebuild her life on her own terms. "Thank you," she replied, squeezing his hand. "For everything." After Richard left, Margaret moved through her new apartment, making small adjustments to furniture placement, unpacking a few more items, familiarizing herself with the space that would now be her home. In the study, she unpacked her laptop and placed it on the desk by the window, where the morning light would be perfect for writing. The memoir she had postponed for years now called to her with new urgency, not just her professional journey as an educator, but her personal evolution as a woman learning, sometimes painfully, to value herself. Her phone buzzed with a text. From Olivia, just checking in. "How's the new place? Kids excited to see it this weekend." Margaret smiled as she typed her reply, coming together beautifully. "Tell Sophie I've set aside a shelf just for her to organize." Another text arrived, this one from Mrs. Chen. "Don't forget to put salt in all corners tonight. Old Chinese tradition for new home. Keeps away bad spirits." Margaret made a mental note to honor this tradition, even if she didn't share the belief behind it. The friendship with Mrs. Chen had taught her the value of cultural exchanges, of learning new ways to mark life's transitions and honor its significant moments. As she prepared for her first night in the new apartment, Margaret felt a profound sense of rightness. 3 months ago, standing locked out on her son's porch, she had felt diminished, disrespected, a mother whose value had been reduced to what she could provide rather than who she was. Tonight, she stood in a home she had created for herself, surrounded by choices she had made independently, her future secured by her own advocacy and determination. The Mother's Day lockout had been meant to sideline her, to remove her from the family narrative except when convenient. Instead, it had awakened a dormant strength, a clarity of purpose that had allowed her to reclaim not just her financial security but her sense of self-worth. A final text arrived as she was settling into bed, from an unexpected source. Eric's name on the screen caused a momentary tightening in her chest, a complex mixture of hope and wariness. "The kids miss you," the message read. "Vanessa and I are still processing everything, but we don't want Sophie and Max to lose their relationship with you. Maybe we can talk after your weekend with them?" Margaret read the message several times, considering her response carefully. The olive branch was tentative, possibly tactical rather than genuine, but it was an opening nonetheless. For her grandchildren's sake, if nothing else, she would accept it, cautiously, with clear boundaries, but without bitterness. "I'd like that," she replied simply. "The children's well-being comes first." Setting the phone aside, Margaret turned off the bedside lamp and let the unfamiliar darkness of her new bedroom envelop her. Tomorrow would bring more unpacking, more organizing, more steps in this unexpected journey. But tonight, in the quiet of her new beginning, she allowed herself to acknowledge how far she had come since that painful Mother's Day afternoon. The morning sun streaming through unfamiliar windows woke Margaret earlier than usual. For a moment, she lay still, orienting herself in the new space, the different play of light and shadow, the subtle sounds of the retirement community stirring to life outside, the knowledge that this day, like every day going forward, would be shaped by her own choices rather than others' expectations. She rose and moved to the balcony, watching the desert landscape transform in the morning light. The mountains that had appeared purple in yesterday's sunset now stood sharp and clear against the brightening sky, their ancient presence a reminder of perspective, how small human dramas appeared against the backdrop of geological time. Her phone chimed with a calendar reminder, 10 a.m. meeting with Henderson Community College Foundation. Another piece of her new life falling into place, discussions about establishing the scholarship fund that would transform part of the house proceeds into educational opportunities for others. The foundation director had been enthusiastic about Margaret's proposal, particularly her emphasis on supporting single parents pursuing education degrees. As she prepared for the day, selecting a professional outfit from her carefully organized closet, Margaret reflected on the strange gratitude she now felt for that painful Mother's Day. Without the shock of being locked out, without the harsh clarity it had provided about her son's priorities and her own vulnerability, she might have continued in the same patterns indefinitely, giving without limits, supporting without reciprocation, placing everyone's needs above her own. The doorbell rang precisely at 8:30, Mrs. Chen, predictable in her punctuality, arriving with a basket of breakfast pastries and more practical advice for settling into the new space. "You need plants," the older woman announced without preamble, stepping inside and assessing the apartment with a critical eye. "Living things bring energy. We'll go to the nursery after your meeting." Margaret smiled, accepting both the pastries and the directive with equal appreciation. "Good morning to you too, Lily." Mrs. Chen waved away the greeting as unnecessary between friends of their depth. "Did you put salt in corners?" "I did," Margaret confirmed, pouring coffee for both of them. "And I hung the red ribbon on the door handle as you suggested." "Good, good," Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "Now, tell me about this scholarship idea. James mentioned it when he called yesterday." As they shared breakfast on the balcony, Margaret outlined her vision for the Margaret Reynolds Education Scholarship, supporting single parents pursuing teaching degrees, with preference given to those interested in working in underserved communities. It would be modest initially, but structured to grow over time through additional contributions and investment returns. A proper legacy, Mrs. Chen declared with satisfaction. Much better than leaving everything to ungrateful children. The blunt assessment made Margaret laugh despite herself. Eric isn't entirely ungrateful. Just misguided. And influenced by Vanessa's priorities. Humph, Mrs. Chen's skepticism was evident in the single syllable. "The text last night, what did Richard call it?" "Tactical." "Possibly," Margaret acknowledged. "But for Sophie and Max's sake, I'm willing to try rebuilding some kind of relationship. With very clear boundaries this time." This was perhaps the most profound lesson she had learned since Mother's Day, that love didn't require surrendering her dignity, that generosity shouldn't leave her vulnerable, that maintaining relationships didn't mean accepting mistreatment. The boundaries she was establishing with Eric and Vanessa weren't about punishment but about self-protection and mutual respect. "Wise," Mrs. Chen nodded. "Forgiveness does not mean becoming a doormat again." After breakfast, Margaret prepared for her foundation meeting, gathering the proposal documents she had carefully prepared with Richard's assistance. As she collected her materials, her eyes fell on the family photograph she had decided to keep. Displayed, the snapshot of happier times before the fractures had become so evident. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had been lost, the easy family gatherings, the unconditional welcome in her son's home, the assumption of being valued simply for who she was rather than what she could provide. The grief was real and deserved acknowledgement. But alongside the grief was something else, something that had been born in the painful aftermath of being locked out, a fierce determination to create a life of meaning and purpose on her own terms, regardless of whether her children approved or understood. The woman who had stood locked out on Mother's Day would never have imagined herself here 3 months later, financially secure, emotionally stronger, surrounded by new friends and opportunities, no longer defined primarily by her role as mother and grandmother but as a woman with her own identity and value. "Ready?" Mrs. Chen called from the living room, impatient as always. "Ready," Margaret confirmed, gathering her purse and proposal folder. As they stepped out into the bright Nevada morning, Margaret paused briefly at her new front door. Not with uncertainty, but with appreciation for the threshold she had crossed, both literally and figuratively. They had locked her out on Mother's Day, never imagining that in doing so, they would set her free to discover her own strength, to establish her own boundaries, to create a life that honored not just her roles as mother and grandmother, but her worth as an individual. The red ribbon Mrs. Chen had insisted she hang fluttered in the morning breeze, a symbol, in Chinese tradition, of new beginnings and good fortune. Margaret touched it briefly, a silent acknowledgement of all that had brought her to this moment, both painful and precious. Then, with the quiet confidence of a woman who had faced betrayal and emerged stronger, she stepped forward into the day and the life that now belonged, truly and completely, to her. 6 months after moving into Desert Sunrise Senior Living, Margaret Reynolds stood at the podium in the Henderson Community College auditorium, her voice steady as she addressed the small but attentive audience gathered for the inaugural ceremony of the Margaret Reynolds Education Scholarship. "Education transformed my life," she said, the microphone carrying her words clearly through the space. "As a young widow with 2 small children, my teaching degree wasn't just a career path, it was our lifeline, our security, our future. Today, I'm honored to extend that same opportunity to others facing similar challenges." In the front row, Richard watched with undisguised pride, while Mrs. Chen sat beside him, elegant in a traditional qipao she had brought from China decades earlier and saved for special occasions. Olivia and Marcus had come with their teenage son Tyler, who was recording the ceremony for a family archive. Even Sophie and Max were present, fidgeting slightly in their formal clothes but beaming with excitement at seeing their grandmother. On stage, notably absent were Eric and Vanessa. The tentative communication that had begun with Eric's text message had faltered in the weeks that followed. While Margaret had maintained her relationship with her grandchildren through carefully scheduled visits and the occasional school event, the deeper reconciliation she had cautiously hoped for with her son remained elusive. "Our first recipient," Margaret continued, gesturing toward a young woman seated on the stage, "embodies everything this scholarship represents. Elena Martinez is a single mother of 2, maintaining a 3.9 GPA while working part-time and raising her children. Her commitment to becoming a bilingual education teacher for underserved communities is exactly the kind of dedication we wish to support." Elena, a 29-year-old with determined eyes and a warm smile, stood to receive the ceremonial certificate as the audience applauded. The scholarship would cover her remaining 2 years of education, allowing her to reduce her work hours and focus more on both her studies and her children. As Margaret completed the presentation and stepped back from the podium, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The scholarship represented the perfect transformation of what had begun as pain into something meaningful and lasting. A portion of the proceeds from the house sale, the very house she had been locked out of on Mother's Day, would now fund educational opportunities for generations of students who might otherwise struggle to complete their degrees. The reception following the ceremony was held in the college's faculty lounge, with refreshments provided by the culinary arts program. Margaret moved through the small crowd, accepting congratulations and introducing Elena to various community members who might be helpful connections for her future career. "Grandma." Sophie's voice cut through the polite conversations as the 10-year-old darted between adults to reach Margaret. "Did you see me taking pictures? I got some really good ones of you giving that certificate thing to Ms. Martinez." Margaret embraced her granddaughter warmly. "I did see you, sweetheart. Thank you for documenting such a special day." Max followed more slowly, 7-year-old dignity preventing him from running, though his excitement was evident in his bouncing steps. "Grandma, Tyler says this scholarship thing means you're famous now. Are you famous?" Margaret laughed, kneeling to his level despite her formal suit. "Hardly famous, Max. Just trying to help other families like ours was when your dad and Aunt Olivia were little." "When Dad didn't have a dad?" Max asked with the direct innocence of childhood. "That's right," Margaret confirmed gently. "After your grandfather passed away, it was just the 3 of us for a long time. My teaching job helped us manage Sophie, who had been listening intently, tilted her head thoughtfully. Is that why you're helping Ms. Martinez? Because she doesn't have a husband to help with her kids? The perceptiveness of the question touched Margaret deeply. Exactly right, Sophie. Sometimes families look different than what people expect, but that doesn't make them any less capable or loving. Olivia approached, having overheard the exchange. Mom, you've created something truly special here. Dad would have been so proud. The mention of her late husband brought a bittersweet smile to Margaret's face. Thomas Reynolds had been gone for over 30 years, but his influence remained, in their children, in the values Margaret had maintained throughout her career. And now in this scholarship that honored the journey they had begun together. He would have appreciated the symmetry, Margaret agreed. Using the house proceeds to help others pursue education, just as his life insurance helped me finish my degree after he passed. The reception continued around them, but for a moment, mother and daughter stood in a quiet bubble of shared memory and understanding. Thomas's sudden death from a heart attack when Eric was 6 and Olivia just 4 had reshaped their family forever, forcing Margaret to become both mother and father, provider and nurturer, disciplinarian and comforter. I've been thinking about him more lately, Olivia admitted. Wondering what he would make of everything that's happened this year. Margaret considered the question seriously. He believed in standing up for yourself, but also in leaving doors open for reconciliation. I think he would understand the boundaries I've set, while encouraging me to keep the possibility of healing alive. Speaking of which, Olivia hesitated slightly. Eric asked me to give you something. She reached into her purse and withdrew an envelope, cream-colored and weighty, bearing Margaret's name in Eric's distinctive handwriting. Margaret accepted it with carefully neutral expression, years of school administration having taught her to mask immediate reactions. He wanted to come today, Olivia added quietly. But Vanessa convinced him it might create tension that would distract from your scholarship launch. The explanation was plausible but incomplete. Margaret suspected that pride played a larger role in Eric's absence, the difficulty of facing her publicly after the legal confrontation over the house. The awkwardness of acknowledging her achievement while their own relationship remained strained. I understand, Margaret said simply, neither condemning nor excusing her son's choice. I'm grateful you and the family could be here. She slipped the envelope into her jacket pocket, choosing to read it privately later. Whatever Eric had written, apology, justification, or something in between, deserved her full attention, not a hurried reading at a public event. Mrs. Chen appeared at her elbow, as if summoned by some sixth sense that Margaret needed support. The college president is looking for you, she announced. Something about a newspaper interview. The practical interruption was perfectly timed, allowing Margaret to refocus on the celebration at hand. Duty calls, she smiled at Olivia. Will you bring the children by tomorrow? I've got those new art supplies we talked about. As the reception wound down, Margaret found herself standing beside Richard near the refreshment table, both of them watching Elena Martinez introduce her children, a serious 9-year-old daughter and an energetic 6-year-old son, to the college president. Seeing anything familiar? Richard asked quietly. Margaret nodded, the parallel unmistakable. Me, 30 years ago. Determined, exhausted, and terrified of failing my children. And look how that turned out, Richard observed. 2 successful adult children, 3 grandchildren, a distinguished career, and now a legacy that will benefit students for generations. The assessment was accurate but incomplete. While Olivia had indeed become a successful psychologist with a stable marriage and a kind, thoughtful son, Eric's path had been more complicated, his business ventures unpredictable, his marriage to Vanessa increasingly revealing character flaws Margaret had been reluctant to acknowledge, his treatment of her culminating in the Mother's Day lockout that had forced her to re-evaluate everything. A mixed success, perhaps, Margaret conceded. But I'm proud of what I've accomplished, both professionally and personally. Richard's hand found hers briefly, a gesture of support that had become comfortably familiar over the past months. As you should be. Particularly this past year. Not many people could have transformed a painful family betrayal into something so constructive. The observation touched on what Margaret had come to recognize as perhaps her greatest strength, not the resilience that had carried her through widowhood or the professional competence that had distinguished her career, but her ability to find meaning and purpose even in life's most painful experiences. Later that evening, back in her apartment at Desert Sunrise, Margaret finally opened Eric's envelope. The reception had been followed by a small dinner with the scholarship committee, and she had deliberately postponed this moment until she could give it her full attention. Inside was a handwritten letter, 3 pages long, in the careful script Eric reserved for important communications, so different from his usual hasty scrawl. Dear Mom, it began. First, congratulations on the Scholarship Foundation. Olivia has kept me informed about your plans, and I want you to know that despite everything that's happened between us, I recognize how significant this achievement is and how many lives it will positively impact. Margaret settled into her favorite reading chair, prepared for whatever might follow: recrimination, excuse-making, or perhaps genuine reflection. The past 9 months have forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about myself, my marriage, and the way I've treated you, the letter continued. While I'm still processing many of these realizations, I owe you the respect of complete honesty. What followed was more candid than Margaret had expected, Eric acknowledging that he had allowed Vanessa to dictate the terms of his relationship with his mother for years, admitting that financial self-interest had motivated their secretive plans regarding the house, confessing that the Mother's Day lockout had been primarily Vanessa's idea but one he had weakly agreed to rather than confronting the real issues. The hardest truth to face, he wrote toward the end, is that I failed to stand up for you when it mattered most. On Mother's Day, watching you sit alone on that porch, I knew what we were doing was wrong. But I lacked the courage to oppose Vanessa, to insist on treating you with the respect you deserved, to honor the decades of sacrifice and support you'd given our family. Margaret paused in her reading, allowing herself to feel the complex emotions the letter evoked: gratification at Eric's acknowledgement, lingering hurt from the betrayal, cautious hope for possible healing, and skepticism about whether these insights would translate into meaningful change. I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness, the final paragraph read. What happened can't be undone with a single letter or conversation. But I am asking for the chance to rebuild our relationship, slowly, honestly, with the clear boundaries you've rightfully established. The children miss you being a regular part of their lives, and if I'm truthful, so do I. He had signed it simply, your son, Eric, the phrasing itself an acknowledgement of the familial bond he had temporarily devalued but now wished to honor again. Margaret set the letter aside and moved to her balcony, needing the evening air and open sky to process her thoughts. The desert sunset painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, a daily natural spectacle that never failed to provide perspective. 9 months had passed since that Mother's Day when she had stood locked out on her son's porch, her dignity under assault and her place in the family suddenly uncertain. In those 9 months, she had reclaimed her financial security, established new friendships, deepened her relationship with Richard, created a meaningful legacy through the Scholarship Foundation, and perhaps most importantly, developed a new understanding of her own worth independent of her roles as mother and grandmother. The question now was whether to open the door to reconciliation with Eric, not on the old terms of unconditional support and occasional exploitation, but on new terms of mutual respect and clear boundaries. Her phone chimed with a text from Richard, thinking of you after today's triumph. Dinner tomorrow? The simple message brought a smile to her face. At 64, Richard embodied everything she valued in a companion: intelligence without arrogance, support without suffocation, romance without unrealistic expectations. Their relationship had developed gradually over the past 9 months, both of them bringing the wisdom of experience to this new connection. Yes to dinner, she replied. And yes to your unasked question about Eric's letter. He's reaching out. Thoughtfully, for once. Richard's response came quickly. How do you feel about it? The directness of the question was characteristic of him, no platitudes, no assumptions, just a genuine interest in her perspective. Margaret considered carefully before responding, cautiously optimistic. The letter shows real reflection. But actions will matter more than words. Setting her phone aside, Margaret returned to contemplating the sunset. Eric's letter represented a potential new beginning, but she was no longer the woman who would rush toward reconciliation at any cost. The Margaret who had emerged from the Mother's Day crisis was more discerning, more self-protective, more aware of her own value. The following morning brought another development: an email from Elena Martinez, the scholarship recipient, expressing not just gratitude but a desire to learn more about Margaret's educational philosophy. Your journey from widowed mother to respected educator to scholarship founder inspires me, Elena wrote. I would be honored if you would consider mentoring me as I complete my degree. The request resonated deeply with Margaret. Throughout her career as an educator and administrator, mentoring had been one of her greatest joys, recognizing potential in others and helping them develop it fully. In retirement, she had missed this aspect of professional life. Without hesitation, she replied affirmatively, suggesting they meet weekly for coffee and conversation about educational theory, classroom management, and the particular challenges of balancing single parenthood with professional development. As she sent the email, Margaret reflected on how the painful events of Mother's Day had ultimately led her here, to this new phase of life rich with purpose and connection. Had she remained in the comfortable but constraining role of family matriarch, always available, often taken for granted, would she have recognized this opportunity to influence a new generation of educators? Would she have found the courage to establish the scholarship foundation, to deepen her relationship with Richard, to discover parts of herself that had been submerged beneath decades of prioritizing others' needs? The morning sun streamed through her eastern windows as Margaret prepared for a busy day. Breakfast with Mrs. Chen, a meeting with the scholarship committee to discuss next year's selection process, lunch with Olivia to hear more about Eric's current thinking, and an afternoon visit from Sophie and Max, who were eager to use the art supplies she had purchased for their creative projects. Her phone rang as she was finishing her coffee. Mrs. Chen, characteristically direct, "Did you read the letter? What did Eric say?" Margaret smiled at her friend's impatience. "Good morning. To you too, Lily." "Yes, I read it." He was surprisingly thoughtful and self-aware. "Humph," came the skeptical response. 9 months too late, if you ask me." "Better late than never," Margaret replied, surprising herself with the generosity of the sentiment. People grow at different rates. Eric has always needed more time to process emotional challenges. "You are too forgiving," Mrs. Chen declared, though her tone carried more affection than criticism. "This is why you needed me after Mother's Day, to be angry when you were too nice to allow yourself proper outrage." The observation held truth that Margaret acknowledged freely. "And I'm grateful for your righteous indignation on my behalf. It gave me permission to recognize the legitimacy of my own anger." Their friendship had indeed been built on this complementary dynamic, Mrs. Chen's forthright indignation balancing Margaret's inclination toward understanding and reconciliation. Together, they had found a middle path that honored both perspectives. "I'm still watching him," Mrs. Chen warned. "One wrong move, and I will tell him exactly what I think of sons who lock mothers out on Mother's Day." The fierce loyalty warmed Margaret's heart. "I wouldn't expect anything less. Now, shall we meet at the usual place? I have those curriculum materials you wanted to see for your grandson." The day unfolded with the pleasant rhythm Margaret had established in her new life, productive meetings interspersed with meaningful personal connections, professional contributions balanced with family time. Each interaction reflected the woman she had become since the Mother's Day crisis, more assertive about her own needs, more selective about her commitments, more aware of her intrinsic value beyond her family roles. Lunch with Olivia provided deeper context for Eric's letter. "He and Vanessa are in counseling," Olivia explained as they shared a salad at their favorite cafe. Separately and together, the house situation brought a lot of issues to the surface. Margaret listened attentively, neither dismissing the information nor investing too much hope in it. "I'm glad they're getting professional support. That's a positive step." "Vanessa didn't want him to write to you," Olivia continued. "She's still angry about how everything turned out with the house. But Eric insisted. He said it was time to start making decisions based on his values, not just keeping the peace." This development interested Margaret more than the counseling. Throughout his adult life, Eric had tended to follow the path of least resistance, particularly in his marriage. Standing up to Vanessa, even in something as simple as writing a letter, represented genuine growth. "How are the children managing through all of this?" Margaret asked, her concern for Sophie and Max remaining paramount despite the adult complications. Olivia's expression softened. "They miss the way things were before, the easy family gatherings, the spontaneous visits with you. But they're also adapting to the new arrangements. Sophie especially seems to appreciate the special time with you at Desert Sunrise. She told me your apartment is her creativity zone, where she can explore art without Vanessa worrying about mess." The description brought a smile to Margaret's face. She had deliberately set up her second bedroom with art supplies, books, and comfortable floor cushions where her grandchildren could feel free to express themselves without the rigid expectations Vanessa often imposed at home. "And the scholarship ceremony yesterday?" Margaret asked. "How did they process seeing me in that role?" "They were impressed," Olivia confirmed. "Sophie kept saying how proud she was that her grandmother was helping other kids' moms go to college. And Max asked if he could tell his class about it for show and tell." This, perhaps more than anything else, reassured Margaret that her decision since Mother's Day had been right, not just for herself, but for her grandchildren. By standing up for her own dignity and worth, by refusing to accept disrespect, even from family, by creating something meaningful from a painful experience, she was modeling values that Sophie and Max would carry into their own lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.